Good morning, everyone. My name is Dan Coviello, and I'm here with a wonderful group of panelists ranging from many different ages, regions, backgrounds, and I think we're all excited to talk today about the title, which is SDGs, Making Youth the Driving Force. Now, like I said, I'm Dan Coviello. Good morning.
Morning, Dan. Great to be here.
Morning, Dan.
Morning. It's afternoon here. Anyway,
And you'll have to bear with me for a second. And let's see. Here, I'm just going to speak from right here. I'm currently on the board of Global Institute for Youth, and I am formerly a NGO youth representative for Terra Mitra and former chair of the DPI NGO Youth Representative Program. And while working at the UN, I was fortunate to also be a policy analysis intern at the UN Division for Sustainable Development. So while we're talking here today, it's definitely a merger of two of my passions, and I think the passions of everybody who is on this phone call today. Now, just to give everybody a little bit of background, the Sustainable Development Goals are a new universal set of goals and targets that, when adopted by the UN in just to give everybody a little bit of background. My apologies, everyone. I believe that I was muted, and I think we can move forward and get past that little technical difficulty. I was talking a little bit about the new Sustainable Development Goals that we are approaching and which are soon to be adopted. And I also wanted to give a little bit of background on the Global Institute of Youth before we got started. At the Global Institute, we're committed to providing young people the tools they need to lead positive change in their communities through advocacy, education, and leadership development. We hope today's discussion will highlight the need to make youth the driving force behind the implementation and success of the SDGs, as well as a chance to reflect on the process so far and how we can move forward. Before we get started, I'd like to encourage those watching to live tweet us your thoughts throughout the discussion and to make sure to use the hashtag GI4Youth. Today's Hangout will also be shared on YouTube for later viewing. So I'd like to start off by asking the participants to introduce themselves a little bit and share how they're involved in the post-2015 development agenda process. And I think we'll start with Andrea, if that's all right. We hope today's discussion will highlight the need.
Sure. Can you hear me? Can you hear me okay?
And success of the SDGs. Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, great. There's just some feedback. I'm not sure, like, if everyone can make sure we're all muted when we're not talking. There's, like, a lot of feedback. That would be great.
That might have been on my end.
No worries, guys. Well, it's great to be here. Thank you so much for organizing this panel, to Natasha at the Global Institute for Youth and to Dan for moderating. My name is Andrea Glauber. I'm currently at the United Nations Foundation working on the post-2015 team and the policy team. And my role is to organize all of our events. We do a lot of member state convenings where we try to bring together different countries around the SDGs and around other issues in the post-2015 process to get them to sort of talk about the more difficult issues that come up in the formal negotiations at the UN. So I have a large role in that. And prior to that, I was also working on the post-2015 agenda at Save the Children, on their global development policy team back in 2012. So that's my relationship with the SDGs.
Thank you very much. I'd now ask Ayodele Taofiq-Fanida to introduce yourself.
Thank you for having me. I'm Ayodele Taofiq-Fanida, a development practitioner, a skills development advocate. I'm a business.
Hello, everyone. Sorry if there's additional problems. But I think what we can do is move on to Ravi. Ravi, would you introduce yourself, please?
Very quickly, my name is Ravi Karkara, and I work and support youth organizations. I currently work for UN Women as an advisor to the Deputy Executive Director, but in my other role, I'm also the co-chair of the Policy Strategy Group on World We Want 2015. And the reason I'm really here is because I was sharing a story with Dan earlier on that 3 years ago, I remember getting a call from Corinne Woods, who worked for UN Millennium Campaign, saying that we really need to strengthen youth participation in the development of the post-2015 agenda. And that time, the UNDG was coming up with the guidance for country offices, and it was 100 national consultations were created. So I did contribute on why is it important to strengthen youth participation. This is really 3 years ago in August. So imagine after 3 years that we're sitting on this Google Hangout, and I think it's the best thing which has happened, because we've seen in the last 3 years, we've seen this extensive participation of young people. We've seen more than 6 million young people participate in the My World survey. A survey which was not supposed to be youth-led became Youth Takeover survey, which I think is absolutely monumental. And the World We Want data analysis and the visuals that are coming out of that also talks about how young women and young men from different backgrounds have been participating extensively. And I'll talk more about this later on. Thank you. Great to be here.
Yep. Thank you very much. And now I'd love to hear from Olimar.
Hi, everybody. My name is Olimar Maisonet, and I have actually been involved with the SDG process ever since it started being negotiated during Rio Plus 20. Back then, which I believe is almost like 5 years ago, I was working as the policy coordinator for the UN Major Group of Children and Youth, and the SDGs basically became my pet project. It was the topic that I followed through all the negotiations, and even like during the Rio negotiations, that was the session that I always sought to attend, and particularly within the UN Major Group of Children and Youth, we saw that the SDGs were going to be a big opportunity for us to talk about the world we wanted, like the sort of development we wanted to see in the next 15 years. So that became a topic that was central to all of our advocacy efforts. I believe we were one of the first major group at the UN to put together suggestions about like how we envision these SDGs to look, what issues were important to them for youth, and at that moment we were mostly like working with the youth that were present in Rio. But happy to report that a lot of those priorities are reflected in this outcome that was published a couple of weeks ago. And I'm currently working as a policy coordinator for IREX, where I mostly look at the issues related to technology access to information, and how we can make sure that new technologies are being connected with young people and that they're able to take advantage for them and to promote their own development. So happy to be here and glad to see some familiar faces in the Hangout.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And I will admit that the feedback was on my side. I had it playing on YouTube also, just reminding everybody this can play on YouTube as well. And I was so excited about the Hangout, I was watching both of them. So that's why there was a little bit of feedback on our end. But once again, thank you to our panelists. I know we're excited to get started. And thank you, Olimar, for sharing that this hasn't been a process that started a year ago, 6 months ago. This has been an ongoing process, and there's been a number of ways that young people have been able to engage with the United Nations, with people in their communities, to see how they can influence and participate in this process. Now, I wanted to start off with a question related to maybe focusing on the greatest successes that you see youth have had in this post-2015 process, and at the same time some of maybe the shortcomings or failures of youth engagement in this process. And I think now's an ideal time to talk about this, now that the proposed declaration is out there, and a lot of the hard work in terms of formulating that document is over, but we're moving into a critical step moving forward. So this is a key time to reflect. So I will open it up to a crowd, and maybe Olimar, we can start with you since you've been involved for a while, on some of the achievements that we've had from the youth perspective, and maybe some shortcomings.
Sure. So one of the biggest achievements that I have seen during this process is the fact that the development community, overall, the UN, stopped looking at youth like a very passive recipient of development assistance, like youth as the beneficiary of our programs, but rather starting thinking about young people, about people that are able to take matters in their own hands and also be partners for development. Throughout this whole process, ever since the beginning, there have been a lot of vocal youth, making sure that that message was shared across the board, that it was shared to everyone from program implementers on the ground to like Ban Ki-moon, making sure that we're not passive, that we have power and we are able to take care of our own development. So as long that we have like the tools necessary for that program, for that purpose. So I think like the communication of that message and the fact that the development community was able to see that was very powerful, and perhaps what I think is going to be most important like moving forward. And in terms of shortcomings, we would like every young people to have a voice and everyone to be present in the process. But we haven't like figured that out. There's so many of us. There's so many young people out there. Some of them do not have access to the internet, are not able to like see like this hangout now, are not able to come to like New York to like the negotiations. So trying to still figure out that those voices that are left behind become part of like the process in the next step of like making sure that the sustainable development goals are part of the development plans is a necessary thing to do, and something that we should like spend some time thinking about how to do better.
Wonderful. Thank you. And Ravi, if I could get your input on this, I think that would be great, just especially since you've been involved with young people for so long. Have you noticed a transition in terms of how people are looking at young people engaged in this process? And I'd like you to also talk about maybe successes and shortcomings from your perspective.
Yeah, I just realized that I should have, said that I've been working on youth participation for 20 years now, so which is quite a long time, including my PhD, which is on youth engagement and social transformation. I think what you've seen over the last 2 decades is really the evolution of youth participation. But if you go back to the evidence we created in the Youth 21 process from UN Habitat, we basically went back to 1936 and talked about in 1936, after the World War I, young people were talking about the space and a legitimate part of decisions that affect them. And fast forward decades, we are still talking about that. But if you go back to the Millennium Development Goals, the announcements in 2000, which brought together about 5 or 6 young leaders at the Millennium Summit, and I was speaking to one of them, in fact 2 of them right after the summit many years, 10 years ago, and they said, a week after the summit, first of all, we were not involved in writing the MDGs. Second, we were very tokenistically put on the stage because we were the millennials to be put on the stage that this is affecting us. And then after that, nobody contacted us. So now if you move at the various ways by which young people have participated, of course, the Rio +20, which was fantastic, and the youth, the spark which happened there. I think what we saw in the very clear first part of the post-2015 development agenda was the high-level panel, and also the national consultations. The national consultations really actively went out. In fact, one of the analysis that came out, they said many country offices of the UN were surprised the way young people really participated because these were offline consultation processes. The second part was the high-level panel, where the high-level panel members were consulting with young people, and there were fantastic discussion around a breakthrough at Bali, if you remember, where the Indonesian youth groups really brought in the youth conversation into the center. And in terms of the online engagement and the My World survey, which was given to us, was I remember, brief coming and getting a call from somebody who's very senior in the UN system saying, Ravi, youth are not participating in the My World survey. And today we're sitting with 6 million youth votes. The most important point is that 4 million youth votes are paper ballots. They are offline votes. These are young people who are sitting in favelas, in slums, and in rural communities who do not have access to technology. But the young people who did have access to technology went youth to youth and brought, I'll give you one specific example and really commend the Mexico City's Youth Institute, which went during the summer last year, between May and August, and brought close to 1.2 million youth votes, and mostly offline. So we've seen that how young people have participated. And I must say that for me, the learning was really how young people were also influencing the discussion. I think the major group on children and youth did a remarkable job, and the other youth who were sitting in New York, really being part of those negotiations, influencing that decision making. So I would say that if people are pessimistic and say, oh, the 17 goals are announced, for me, the biggest success of the Sustainable Development Group process is youth engagement in the building and final adoption of Sustainable Development Goal. Because for people like me, it gives me a lot of confidence that young people will be part of sharing and amplifying what these SDGs are. B, will be partners in the implementation of Sustainable Development Goals. And third, most importantly, young people will continue to monitor and hold member states to account, because all that did not happen in the MDG process. And in terms of the shortcomings, so I'm always looking at half glass full. But in terms of the shortcoming, I would say, agree with my colleague who's talked about that, if we apply the human rights principle of non-discrimination and inclusion, did we reach out to as many young women and young men? So gender perspective is very important. Will the gender perspective be sustained in the next 15 years? The diversity perspective, where is the LGBTQI community? Where are youth with disabilities and the multiple forms of disabilities? The indigenous youth, the rural youth. So I think for us to make this truly universal, we'll have to use combination of online and offline technologies, and also work with youth-led organizations, both in the ground but also online. So this really is from my perspective.
Yeah, thank you for your input. And just to give a little bit of context, you touched a little bit on it in terms of how the MDG process compares to the SDG process. One key thing that was used to create the Sustainable Development Goals was the Open Working Group on Sustainable Development Goals, and major groups and other stakeholders were given a key place in that space, and the children and youth took advantage of it. And I think some of the people on this panel would agree to that. Another thing that's a little bit different with the Sustainable Development Goals is that they are universally applicable. So this is everybody's in this together, and we're working on how to adapt it and to our specific areas. Now, let's see. I think, Andrea, I'll look for your input a little bit on this. I know you kind of operate at a little bit of a nexus point in between the UN Foundation, member states, and also working with major groups and NGOs. Could you give some input on this?
Sure. So what Ravi was saying about how youth have really taken ownership of this and been involved, I think that has really been reflected in the actual member state negotiations. I mean, up until the very end, Ambassador Kamau from Kenya, who was one of the co-facilitators of the final post-2015 negotiations, as well as the initial Open Working Group set of negotiations, brought one of the Secretariat staff's daughters up onto the dais and said, this is Sophia, and let's remember why we're all here. I think she was about 4 or 5 years old, and she had been sitting patiently through the final weekend of negotiations. And he said, this is Sophia's agenda, and let's deliver the most ambitious agenda we can deliver for her and for other children like her. So it was really nice to see that reflected right through to the very end. I was really impressed with the amount of participation on social media, and I know that we said it's difficult for youth who don't have access to those technologies, but I think we can be optimistic in the next 15 years about keeping youth involved and getting more youth involved and connected. There's a huge revolution in mobile technology, and a huge revolution in innovation and bringing innovation together with the UN to achieve the SDGs. And I think if we really, put the pedal to the metal, we can really make some great strides in connecting those youth who are less easy to access.
Thank you. And Ayodele, I'd love to get your input on this process as the managing partner of Development Diaries. What would be your perspective on youth engagement in the post-2015 development process?
Thank you. I think so far so good. The youth, and it has been encouraging having people on board of the post-2015 process. Looking around compared to MDG process, there's a clear margin between now and then. During the MDG's process, a lot of young people were carried along, a lot of stakeholders were missed out, but now everybody are engaged, carried along, especially the young folk. Even the private sector are now being carried along. And we have a lot of young entrepreneurs, everybody's being carried along. And for me, again, the success of this program compared to the MDGs, the early start, now we're starting early. Like one of my colleagues there said, 5 years ago, she has been on the board advocating for post-2015 goals. But now, we're in 2015, a number of persons already knows, what SDG is all about, when it's coming up, that come September, leaders will adopt all the 17 goals compared to year 2000. During the process, a number of us were much younger. We don't know anything. Adults who are very much available compared in my country. It was 5 years after the MDG has been signed. 5 years after the MDG has been signed, that was when my former president of the country, was now running back to say, we have 10 years more to go. Can we begin to work towards the achievement of this goal? But unlike now, we're all working towards the success and the success of this goal, even from the beginning. And again, I feel now, as it is, from the beginning to this point, young people have been contributing a lot to the document. We have a number of documents that has been worked upon with young people input, and that takes to my fear. Now, as we have all of this, all the world back in my country, a number of our governments have been slow. They're not engaging people in this part of the world is a bit difficult. I hope it's going to change. Looking at the last election that was held in Nigeria, young people's role, young people's awareness, and that show off in the election. I hope young people engagement, as it was during the last election, will come for the success of the SDGs.
Thank you very much. I think you touched on a number of good points, some of which we're going to be exploring a little bit more later on in our conversation, specifically about the role of young people engaging with their governments in terms of the follow-up process. You touched on youth entrepreneurship, which has been key point in this process, and that's something I know that some of our listeners would love to learn about a little bit more from your perspectives. Now I'd like to move on to the next question, and it's something that we've addressed in our, I guess, introductions already, and that's how has social media and technology influenced the development of the post-2015 development agenda? How do you think it's going to be used moving forward? And how do we reach out and connect with young people who don't necessarily have these types of technologies? And I know that each of you have been involved with social media, and I'll probably go to Ravi first, especially with the World We Want survey. But what are some of your insights on how it's been used and how we can use it moving forward?
I think one of the biggest revelation for me was one of the briefings, which was, that yes, we will use technology, but we have to make sure that people who do not have access to technology are also part of this process. So the case in point really is that 2.5 years ago, I came up with this notion of creating global youth advocates for the My World and World We Want. And I reached out to many youth-led organizations. I was surprised the amount of enthusiasm that it received, but also, the fact that, technology cannot replace offline engagement. That is the #1 principle. But technology can enable bringing the voices of people who have digital divide into the conversation. So for me, I would say that, for the next 15 years, it is important to very clearly apply right in the front the principle of youth participation, of non-discrimination, saying that if we are doing technology, we have to use, whether based on the geographical location, it is the SMS campaigning. So we may be looking at that from the African perspective. And I was very surprised just on the technology bit, where Western Europe and North America, who have access to all the technology, if you go to the data.myworld2015.org website, you'll see these are the countries who have least participated in the My World survey. So the assumption that because you have technology and access to technology doesn't mean that you will be engaged. In fact, it is the youth-led organizations, the cooperative, the movements, whether it's in Pakistan or India or Philippines or in China or South Korea or in Serbia or in Mexico or in Brazil, who went out there because these youth organizations were also evolved in their own movements or semi-movements. And they use this as a binding force to bring their voices, but not the only one, because they were using other channels to influence subnational, national processes, regional processes, and of course the important global processes. I would also say if we go back and do an analysis, I'm sure the Sustainable Development Goal process, the post-2015 development process, which also has created some kind of a synergy and binding of the youth movement, in the world. Because I think definitely you see that, because I was there in Rio during the youth meeting, and then you see that huge force, and then you see a very strong engagement. What needs to happen is the sustaining that momentum has to now go back and come up from the bottom perspective. So how will SDG implementation affect a young woman with disability belonging to a minority group, say an X place in middle of say Africa or part of India or X place? I think that is really the test of our time. At the same time, I would say how will young people who use technology to their advantage will also ensure that young people who don't, their voices and perspective are brought into the center of the world. And that's why I always put my global location not as New York or global, I put that as glocal. And glocal is GLOCAL, which means local to global and global to local. And that's what we have to apply in the process. And in terms of the world we want, I think the world we want has created the first ever, the big data on people's voices. And My World was intended to be the big data on people's voices. But for me personally, My World became the big data on youth voices. So thank you.
Thank you. Now, I'd love to jump to Olimar, specifically as a policy coordinator for IREX's Center for Collaborative Technologies. I feel like this is an appropriate question for you also.
Sure. When I think about the role of technology, social media, and how has that changed policy conversations, there's 3 words that come to my mind. First is reach, second is time, and the third one is synergy, as Ravi mentioned. Time, because whenever something happens, the internet makes it spread or within seconds. The moment there was a document at New York, people all over the world that were following like the hashtag of the post-2015 negotiations knew about it. Whenever someone said a comment during one of the negotiations that people like, everyone that was online at that point was able to hear it or to read it. So the fact that we are able to reach people that fast is very important for our, or it was very important in a process like the SDG, or even at the national scale and elections, you're seeing like that very same sort of event. It allows you to have a conversation at the same time, because you're not being just a passive recipient of informations like we used to see before, but rather you're having people like responding to statements that they're hearing on their TV or they're reading online, and they're also giving you feedback and are improving like the process through that time. And I mean, that's related to reach. You're reaching people at a larger scale that we used to, like, I don't know, like what we have seen before. And that's particularly important when you're talking about young people. When you look at the numbers, young people tend to be like the biggest population that is online. So at least you're reaching a vast numbers of them. And then the comment about synergy, I have to agree a lot with what Ravi mentioned about how the SDGs, how the development process gave all of the youth movements a rally, like a cry to work together. We all saw, particularly during those conversations that were happening in Rio, that were happening in New York, and that continue to happen through different national consultations, that a lot of the same issues that youth were dealing either in Africa, in Latin America, even in the United States, were similar when it comes to like access to education. Everyone wants to go to school, everyone wants to learn, everyone wants to graduate and get skills because they want to get a job, they want to have means to support themselves. And being able to see that you're not alone in that fight, that other youth all over the world want the same thing that you want, I think it allows for all of these groups to develop solidarity, and that was very important during like a process like this. And moving forward, I think it's going to be very important in making like this development agenda a reality, because we are actually like building a world for ourselves, and I don't know what it is about like this generation particularly, but we're very conscious that the issues that we're dealing with are not unique to ourselves. We have like this global mentality that there's other people all over the world like facing like the same issues as we are. So we are pushing like together with this like idealism vision that we want to create a better world. And I know that I struggle a little bit with saying that out loud, but when you're in a room and you're hearing people from all over the world like saying the same thing, it becomes like very powerful. It became very powerful for the policymakers that were at the United Nations, and it becomes like very powerful for you as like a single person with your own problems, like standing there and becoming like part of that movement.
Wow, I agree. Biggest point was the support system, the solidarity movement, building a world for ourselves. I think that resonates with the people on this call and everybody who's watching right now. Now, Andrea, if you could comment on this and the use of social media, maybe from the perspective of how you've seen the different NGOs using social media connect with their different audiences, not only potentially people who are looking to donate to causes, but also people who are looking to engage.
Yeah, so I think Twitter has been extremely useful in allowing regular people to engage with what would normally be very high-level, closed UN processes, and that has done wonders for accountability and transparency and openness at UN negotiations. Many of the UN missions based here in New York and a lot of foreign ministries have dedicated and active Twitter accounts, and they were retweeting things that civil society were tweeting at them, and those priorities were very much reflected in the negotiations. The negotiators knew that the world was watching them. They knew that people could view them online wherever they were if they had access to the internet. So that set the bar much higher for the agenda that they had to deliver, and I think that was reflected in the outcome document that was just released a couple of weeks ago.
Well, thank you. I'm going to move along a little bit more, and I'll have Ayodele speak to this next question I have, primarily because you touched on it a little bit in your first response. Now, young people have placed a great deal of importance on governance and participation in their governments, and this is related to election processes or even decisions that affect them. Specifically, the major group of children and youth has one of their slogans is nothing about us without us. So from your perspective, how do you see young people being engaged in the governance process of their countries moving forward?
Thank you.
I hope that was
I
clear.
think, yeah, sure. Yeah, I think our generation is a lucky one, having access to internet and social media. So that brings it to the issue of engaging the government. As it is very critical and important for young people to engage the government if we really want to achieve anything, most especially as a nation and as in the world generally. As it is, like the example I gave on there, young people contributed a lot to the success of that election. If not for young people, a number of things would have happened. But young people were able to come together to say, no, this is what we want, and do a massive campaign, go on the street, one-on-one, and and every other means, in advocating for change. But now bring that back to sustainable development goals. For we to achieve this target, young people must be ready to engage their government. At every point, young people must go to the government. This is the phase we have. This is the next on the agenda. This is government is giving out money. Young people must be aware. Young people must be ready to track, to monitor, and young people must be ready to hold government accountable. Gone are the days when government will just dish out money. Oh, we're rolling out social amount of money. A good example: there's a campaign, and the last government, that's President Jonathan, gave some huge amount of money for grassroots women on energy cooking stove. But young people were there to track. At the point when the ministry is saying, oh, we have released 70% of the money to the public, but young people were there to say, no, we have been to the grassroots, we've interviewed people on the street, they don't have the cooking stove, but they're saying, oh, and before you know it, a number of people were talking about it, and now the ministry is in question. They are now asking them a lot of questions. What do you do with the money? Where are the cooking stoves? Show us samples, show us evidence where you place some of those cooking stoves. If young people are not there, a number of people will not know what is happening. And as a result, young people bring the message, take the message back to the grassroots, because young people are closer to the grassroots. They are like the intermediary between the government and the grassroots. So whatever is happening at the government level, young people must be ready to engage and feedback the people at the grassroots. It is time, and it's a must for us to do. If not, we will not go anywhere. It is time to start from the grassroots, start from the bottom, if we really want to achieve any change in the sustainable development goal.
Thank you very much, and I completely agree. And I think transparency was a key issue that was in the process, in the discussions, and it's going to be continuing as we move forward, especially as the discussion on the indicators ramps up. How are we going to track the progress? How are we going to hold ourselves accountable and each other accountable? Now, just wanted to let everybody know, Ravi, our our wonderful guest will need to be leaving shortly, and I'd love to get his perspective on this question and maybe add a little bit on his recommendations for youth engaging themselves in the process moving forward.
Thank you very much. Just to reassure that I'm actually moving from one youth event to the next youth event, which is on peace building too. But just to say that, my colleague who spoke about accountability, I've after 20 years of working as a social worker and servicing, whatever I can, I've come up with a principle called the PIA. And if there's no PIA in my work, I don't do it, which is P for participation. Because I think right holders have to be, whether it's young people and women or children, have to participate in decisions that affect them. I is inclusion, which is without the principle of inclusion in terms of gender equality and diversity, then we are not really doing what we are supposed to do. 70 years of UN celebration, we need to ensure that every single person is included. It's about all. And third is really what you said, my dear colleague, is accountability. If there is no accountability, there's no point doing it, including my own personal accountability. Why don't you hold me, everybody else to account who claim that they are working for or on youth issues? And I think youth movement can do a little bit more on that. And I would say that if you look at the My World survey, what surprised many people, and the results started coming in terms of the 16 priorities, and young people were asked to select top 6, many places, Brazil, India, USA, others, accountability, which is honest and responsive governments, came as number 1, number 2, number 3. Because young people made a very clear correlation that the reason there is no impact in their lives is because there is lack of accountability. And if you look at completely from a human rights perspective, African Youth Charter exists, Ibero-American Youth Charter exists. Why don't we have a global declaration on human rights of youth? And that was called by Braga Youth Action Plan way back 20 years ago, which gave the birth to the World Program for Action on Youth. So why aren't young people really recognized as right holders? So I think that's something which is very important, which needs to happen. And the second point, Dan, really is that we are looking at the implementation phase. So it is important that we are creating bottom-up mechanisms which are really walking the talk of youth participation. We cannot work on developing youth policies or policies for youth. Youth have to be, as it was said by my colleague, it has to be with young people. So we've been very strongly advocating, in my other work, has been on permanent structures, which are inclusive, based from bottom up. How do you ensure that a young person is able to influence the village development plan? How does a young person influence the municipal development plan or hold the municipal organizations and their budget to account? So where is the conversation on, like we have the gender budgeting conversation, where is youth budgeting conversation? Where are investments and finances on youth development with participation? So I think there are many things that needs to be defined beyond transparency and accountability, on unpacking accountability from a legislative perspective, from a financial perspective, from a mechanism perspective, and really from participation and inclusion perspective. And I would say that the conversation always has to be not just about youth, it has to be young women and young men coming from diverse backgrounds. So we have to spell that out, because if we will not, there'll be many young women who will be left out, there'll be many minority and youth with disabilities who will continue to be left behind. So this really is a piece that, because it is a 360-degree accountability framework. We also have to be held accountable that in our processes, are we doing really inclusive, or we only are because everybody wants to run to New York or to to Nairobi or somewhere. So this really is important, and I would really like what my colleague talked about earlier, is that we have to consciously, deliberately ensure that the principles of youth participation, which have been agreed by many people, which are honest, transparent participation, voluntary participation, inclusive participation, protective participation, and action-oriented and accountable participation are fundamental to the process of the implementation of Sustainable Development Goals. I don't want to leave, but I have to run to the other side. It'll take me 10 minutes to go to the General Assembly Hall. But I'm so grateful, Dan, and I really hope that this is not the first Google Hangout. I think you have to bring every single negotiator, a UN colleague who's been working on this, a member state, and ask them, how will you work with us? Because we have young people are ready to partner. It is not about just demanding rights, it's about offering partnership. And that is the most important point, because 15 years ago, we did not have the youth bulge. We are sitting on 1.8 billion young people who did not exist 15 years ago, and we are coming to Africa, where you have the second youth bulge coming in. And we need to positively work with young women and young men so that we can truly create social transformation and bring those changes and impact that the 17 goals talk about. So thank you very much, everybody, and talk to you soon.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Ravi. We appreciate your time. Well, I think Ravi definitely touched on a number of great things, and one thing that has been brought up in the last couple statements is that ownership and accountability. Ownership is part of that, and after the first Rio conference in '92, there were a number of local Agenda 21s. It was local communities taking what was decided at the global level, adapting it to themselves, and that was a key way for young people and all people to be engaged. So there's a number of different avenues to really move forward in terms of keeping people accountable. Now, Olimar, I'd love to get your feedback on governance, participation, and accountability in terms of how we move forward, and maybe we can draw on your insights specifically with your time with the major group of children and youth where you were negotiating and working with governments. Can you give a little bit of perspective on maybe some pushback you could have received on this topic?
Sure. So accountability is one of those issues that member states are very sensitive about, and mostly because they always fall upon the phrase that this is not a binding agreement, so technically they're putting their best efforts in good faith, but because it's good faith, we should not really like make them accountable to them, which is tricky when we're talking about creating like development plans and putting like or funding in specific like streams to support or to create solutions to specific like social problems. Accountability works in many different ways, and one of the most positive ways that we have seen like recently is the fact of people, young people, women, minorities, or even other member states reminding government representatives about like the commitments that they have made and making sure that whatever is proposed never goes or never becomes like less than that. So we always, whenever we're advocating, whenever we are in conversations with member states, we always go back to the words that they use in previous conversations. This is what you said 10 years ago, this is what you said in the Rio Agreement, this is what you say in the environment conference like back in '72, what you say now cannot be less than that. So let's use that as a starting point. However, when you think about accountability, particularly within this agenda, I think that the critical part is going to be on the national development plans, because that's where most of the implementation is going to take place. And then is the same process. You need to have like young people, like youth organizations, participating in those conversations, making sure that the development plans that are put in place to meet the Sustainable Development Goals do not go back or do not backtrack in some of like the international commitments that their government representatives have done so, and being or having like a voice, being vocal during that process. At the end is like what accountability is based on. So I would invite all of the youth organizations that are interested in getting involved in this sort of process to start like learning about what are their national development plans in their countries and how they can start becoming part of that conversation.
Thank you very much. I'd like to move to Andrea, and if you can comment on what we've been talking about in terms of national development plans. Have you, through interacting with the different governments, heard talk about that? Are people already moving forward, or are they just trying to take it one step at a time? I don't know. Could you share your insights on this?
Sure. So we actually partnered with Save the Children to host a series of in-country roundtables with different members of government in countries like Colombia, Mexico, Peru, Tanzania, Ghana, and Pakistan, and I think there were one or two others. But basically the conclusion that we arrived at was that countries are already working on all 17 of the SDGs in some capacity. So there shouldn't really be any fear about, oh, we have this huge new framework that we have to implement, because in many countries there's already a ministry in existence that deals with at least one of the SDGs. So youth should feel comfortable, and they should realize that, you know, they have this huge capacity to mobilize their peers and their communities to, you know, not just demand that governments achieve these goals, but, you know, to show them that they're already doing this work in some way, and youth can play a huge role in informing their communities about the goals. There are some resources I would recommend that youth check out. One of those is the World's Largest Lesson. If you just Google World's Largest Lesson, it'll come up. And this site is all about having one universal lesson, like classroom package, to teach youth about the SDGs. There's also Action 2015. That's a great way, that's a great network for youth to plug into, to get involved with. You know, the more voices there are, the stronger they are. Governments are more likely to hear them. I would also recommend that youth check out Project Everyone and Global Citizen, which are all about socializing the goals and making sure that people are aware of them, you know, because the first step to monitoring and implementing the goals is awareness of what they are and what they mean for people around the world.
Thank you, Andrea. And I think that's definitely something we're nearing the end, not quite yet, of our conversation, but I think a key thing to bring up with each participant would be to talk about what resources exist. This could be in the form of campaigns, documents, tips and tricks for working with people, human capital, things of that nature. So, Adelaide, could you share some resources that young people can tap into as we move forward? Can you hear us? Well, maybe I'll move to Olimar, and maybe we can go back to Adelaide on this important question. Olimar, what types of resources can young people tap into moving forward?
Sure. I believe that about 6 months ago, Civicus put together a really good guide on advocacy and how to learn and how to talk about the people within your country that are going to be in charge or that are implementing development initiatives. So I will invite everyone, if you haven't done that already, just to like take a look through that guide. It also provides a really good introduction about not what is the post-2015 process, but how does the post-2015 process like fit overall in the whole like development process that the world has been pushing for, at least like when it comes to like the UN. How does that fit into the work of the UN? How the UN is going to position itself to better meet like the needs of the new development agenda, and as well, how does that process like connect to the national development plans and the work that our governments are doing locally. So I think it's a really good resource. It might be like too long to read through it, but they were so kind that they put together, I think it's a 6 to 8 page of like key points that you need to know, tips about organizing like meetings locally, meeting with your local officials, like learning about your national development plans. So it's a good resource to become aware. As well, there's other great youth organizations, including Restless Development, who have put together like similar resources to help youth not only be informed about the development plans that are in country, but also to take an active role when it comes to accountabilities, how we can use technology, how we can user networks of like youth organizations to hold governments accountable. So off the top of my head, like those are two of my biggest suggestions for becoming more aware of the process and more involved.
Thank you very much. And we'll try and go back to Adelaide right now. We're talking about different resources that young people can share, tap into, learn from, utilize. Any other synonyms you want to use? But Adelaide, can you share some resources with us? Your mic might be muted. I'm not aware. Well, he can't hear us right now, potentially. I can move on to the next question, and hopefully we can get Adelaide to jump in on that. This is going to be the closing question. Now it's something we've spoken about a little bit moving forward. Maybe what are some final words that you have for everybody watching this call or who's going to watch it moving forward? What's something you recommend youth to do? I'll backtrack just 1 second because Adelaide can comment on resources. Please share it with us. Please feel free to comment, Adelaide. On the topic of resources?
Okay.
Yes, wonderful.
Okay. For me, there are a number of resources out there for young people to work with. We have the Sustainable Development Solution Network. They have a youth arm, and they have a brilliant resources. Already, they are doing a campaign called No Nos. You know, they started and they are launching the campaign in September in New York. We have a couple of other materials. We have the Age of Sustainable Development presentation. Is a mock event anchored by Professor Jeffrey Sachs. We have a number of other materials through the mock. We have the World We Want. A number of materials are there, and just like Oliver said, I think a number of young people should digest their national development plan and agenda. Look into their national development plan, look how to engage the government via the plans, and then incorporate the national development. There are a number of materials out there. Young people must be ready to learn and get themselves familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals or the targets and how to come in and engage the government.
Thank you very much, and I believe we're pretty much out of time, so I hope you don't mind if I have the last word right now. I think our panelists have shared a wonderful amount of information. So this ends our discussion. I'd like to extend a sincere thanks to our panelists for taking the time to join us today to share their knowledge and experience, as well as their dedication to the various roles they've played in the post-2015 process. We'd also like to thank our viewers from around the world for joining us today and supporting the work of the Global Institute for Youth. This discussion will be posted on YouTube if you'd like to watch it again, or pass it along to someone who wasn't able to watch it. We hope you'll stay in touch with the Global Institute for Youth, whether through social media or attending one of our events in the United States or Rwanda, and be sure to stay tuned for the launch of our new Youth Ambassadors program in the coming weeks. You can follow us on Facebook or Twitter and check out our website at www.globalinstituteforyouth.org. Thank you again for joining us today, and thank you very much for making today enjoyable for not only me, but I'm sure many other people watching it today. Thank you.